Good morning, everybody. I want to begin by just offering a round of legitimate thank yous. We have, 299 screens, 300 screens now, over 300 screens now, of people who are on this very busy Sunday before Pesach, when everybody has so much to do to get ready for the Seders. You are giving the heart of your morning to this conversation. So I want to thank every person on this call. I want to thank Amy and Brian also always for inviting it, organizing it, and making it happen. And most of all of us on the screen, Micah, want to thank you. Want to thank you for your wisdom, for your friendship, and for this incredibly busy time personally getting ready for the holiday. An incredibly busy time nationally, Israel in the throes of this crisis. You're giving us an hour of your Sunday evening. We're so grateful to you. So Micah, take it away. We are so eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. This lecture will have 4 pieces to it. I'm jumping right into this, okay? We'll have 4 pieces. Last time we spoke, we discussed the nature of the judicial reform, or some Israelis call it judicial revolution. But in the past 2 months, something very serious has happened in Israel. Yariv Levin announced the reform, and then spontaneously, many people responded, reacted. An extremely passionate and impressive protest movement was created. And that protest movement managed to block the reform, to freeze it. Now it's frozen. We're going into negotiation and hopefully, God willing, to compromise. So if last time we discussed the nature of the reform, this time I want to discuss the nature of the protests, the people, the movement protesting against the reform. That'll be part 1. Part 2, last time we studied different arguments of the debate. It was very intellectual. The different arguments of all sides in this constitutional debate we're having in Israel. This time, we're not going to be discussing different sides of the debate. Something deeper is happening in Israel. We're having a social clash between 2 tribes. I want to understand the psychology of this clash, the sociology of this clash, not only the constitutional arguments that are populating this clash. That'll be part 2. In part 3, we'll be asking, is Israel going into civil war? And what are the reasons why we might be going into civil war? And if we have time, what will prevent civil war? Those are 4 parts: the nature of the protest, not the nature of the revolution, the nature of the tribal clash we have in Israel. Is this going to trip to civil war, and how can we prevent it? Those are the 4 parts. So I'm going right at it. And Rabbi, one thing, I am thinking about these issues in Hebrew, and I'm reading about these issues in Hebrew, and I'm writing about these issues in Hebrew. I'm talking about these issues in Hebrew. So English is not comfortable for me discussing these issues. These are all new issues to me. So if I might feel, I'm saying to you, to everybody, if I'm not pronouncing a word correctly, it's probably because I'm not getting the word right. It's not because there's a word that you all don't know. So, and Rabbi, feel free to correct me and help me out here while I'm trying to figure this out in English. Okay, so we're good to go, Rabbi?
We're good to go.
All right. So a very impressive movement was born in Israel. It's hard to exaggerate how impressive this movement is. I want to share 3 characteristics of this movement, which is not an official movement. There's no clear leader. There's no clear organization. It's very spontaneous. On the top, there's like a federation of small groups. There's no clear leader, but there's a very clear message. And it's very passionate. And and every Motzei Shabbat, after Shabbat, there's protesting all over Israel. Throughout the week, there's operations around Israel expressing rejection of this judicial reform, or as they call it, the judicial revolution. And then we had when was Gallant fired? It was last
Monday night.
Sunday night, right? Gallant. Yes, Gallant was Sunday night. And then Sunday night, all this movement unleashed spontaneous energies of hundreds of thousands of young Israelis that after Minister of Defense Gallant was fired by Netanyahu, they went out to the streets, blocked the streets, captured the Ayalon. I'm sure anyone that's here, I'm sure almost all the people that are here today All the 350 people that are here have been to Israel. If you've been to Israel, you've been in a traffic jam in Ayalon. Capture the Ayalon for like 6 hours, lighting fires in the Ayalon. Now, this is extremely passionate image. It's a very passionate. There's very extreme energies are unleashed in Israel. And here's the first characteristic of this unbelievable movement, where there is so much protest, so much passion, and almost no violence. That is an Israeli startup. That is a unique characteristic of this Israeli national uprising against the fear of dictatorship. Can you imagine all over the world, there's like a basic law. It's so basic that we never even noticed it. It's so trivial, we never said it. Where there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of violence. Where there's no violence, there's no passion. Israel's been pulling off the past 2 months a protest that is extremely passionate and not violent at all. 0 people were killed so far. Now, Rabbi, I feel uncomfortable saying this because we have to pray to Hashem that this dynamic will continue. I'm discussing everything that happened till now. I'm not predicting what's going to happen from now. But until now, we're enjoying this unbelievable asymmetry between passion and violence. Israel could create extremely passionate protests which are not violent at all. And just so you feel the dynamic, a close friend of mine was protesting in some place in the south next to Maskeret Batya, and they blocked the road for like an hour. It was that night of Galant, which is a tremendous night in Israel's memory. And then the police came and they asked him, listen, we need to open the road. And they said, fine. They moved aside, they moved the sidewalks, and they were clapping for the police. That's the dynamic we're having in Israel. It's a protest that's not anti-police, has a dialogue with the police. It's a protest that's very passionate and not violent. That's one tremendous characteristic of this protest. The second one is the following. One of the very powerful symbols and clear symbols of this movement is, as we all know, the Israeli flag. Now, this is very amazing because we have a protest, all this energy, protesting against the Israeli government. Now, almost always, we have like a psychological weakness that when we are very passionate against the government, we have a tendency to be passionately against the country itself. It's very hard to create that distinction. And even American Jews have this hard time, remembering that sometimes you're critical of the Israeli government, not the state. It's very hard to hold that. And the more passionate you are, the more angry you are, the harder it is to hold that very subtle distinction. I'm against the policy of the government, not the nature of my country. I love my country. I don't like the government. Now we have this protest that while it's passionately against policies of this government or the reform or revolution, what this government is trying to do, it's against what the government is doing. Not only it's not against the country and the state and Israel, they're protesting with anger towards government and love towards our country. Now that itself is a tremendous mental, emotional achievement of this movement. And this has a lot of implications because I'm going to say something that's wrong. It's not leftist in the street. This is not a right versus left debate, but it is true that many leftists are there. And many people on the left started leaning towards post-Zionism in the past 2 years, started going through that false distinction that if I can't stand the government, I can't stand the country. And now, when they can't stand the government more than ever, they express love for our country more than ever. This is a very, very interesting turn of events, very, very, very powerful. So these are two very impressive elements of this protest. The asymmetry between passion and violence and against government and not against country. It's an expression of love for our country. That's two. And the third one is that, just close your eyes, don't really close your eyes. This patriotism that we see in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Beersheba and Haifa and Kfar Adumim and Maskert, but all over Israel, we see this passion of protesters going out with their flags. If you would see this in Hungary, in Poland, in England or in the Netherlands, you'd see hundreds of thousands of civilians holding the flag of their country and protesting passionately. You would probably believe this is a very right-wing protest. It's a patriotic protest. And what they're against is issues concerning immigration, LGBTQ community, human rights. Because in a false dichotomy we have in the Western mind today, when I'm very patriotic, where you see tremendous outbursts of patriotism, usually it's not very sympathetic to human rights. And when you see people fighting for human rights, many times they don't sympathize the flag, the country, patriotism. Here in Israel, we have something like, if you think about very progressive movements in America, they fight for human rights, but they're not fighting for the country. In some sense, they're despising the country itself. And there's all these narratives that the country itself is to blame and all that, right? And think about what we have in Israel today, the most passionate human rights protest in our history, fighting for human rights, to protect human rights. And that battle is not a battle that's directed against patriotism. It's a patriotic battle itself. Israelis are willing to pull off these days in the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, the yin, the perfect yin and yang, very patriotic and very liberal simultaneously. That marriage of patriotism and liberalism, which is a very important marriage, and it's been split in different countries in Europe, and I think also in the US to some extent. In the past few years, Israelis found the glue, uniting, gluing, marrying patriotism and liberalism. We're fighting for civil rights, and we love our country. We love our country, and because of that, we want our country to be the best it can, protecting human rights. So these are three very impressive characteristics of the protest movement that managed to block, in the meantime, to freeze legislation and to take this whole course of history towards negotiation and compromise. I'm not predicting what's going to happen. I just want to mention that this is a very effective protest, and it's effective. It's a yin and yang protest. Patriotic and liberal. It's effective because it's against the government, but not against the country. And it's effective because it's extremely passionate and not violent at all. So those are three characteristics of this protest, which is turning it into one of the most impressive protests in the history, probably the most impressive protest in the history of Israel. It might be one of the most impressive protests in in the history of Western civilization.
Wow. So Micah, that's part one.
No. And after saying that, there's a dark side to these protests. After saying that, there's a problem with these protests. One of the things that this protest has given birth to is the threat we hear from pilots, the threat we hear from people serving in A200 and intelligence, the threat we hear from people serving in very, very elite and special units, the MEMEM, the threat that if this legislation passes, we're not showing up. We're not showing up. Now this is something we might be careful. This threat was made. They weren't bluffing. They were really planning. We're not showing up. This threat might materialize in the next few weeks if the reform starts passing. And I just want to notice two things. This is something, and after this creates a new reality in Israel. It creates a new reality. And I don't want to go into military secrets, but I just want to say, if a pilot doesn't show up for a month, I don't want to say numbers, but a very, very large part of the Israeli Air Force are in reserves, or in Miluim. I mean, they're not, which means if you're a pilot in Miluim and reserves, it means you're now working you're a lawyer in Tel Aviv, and every Tuesday, you go to your army base, you fly a plane, just so you stay qualified, then you go back to your law to be a lawyer. And many Israelis, extremely patriotic, amazing Israelis, our most talented Israelis, that's how they live. Once a week, they go to the military. And here's the thing. I don't know if I should say this, but just because of there's this, if for a certain period you don't show up, you're disqualified. And if this will happen, critical mass of our pilots don't show up for a certain period, we don't have an Air Force. Okay, which will make Israel, now you're all reading you all know what's going on in the world. You all know that Iran is getting close to 90% enrichment. You know what's happening with Hezbollah, what's happening in Syria. You know what's happening in West Bank, Judea, Samaria. Israel is in a very fragile point security-wise, and we might be in a position that at the moment of history where we need to be the strongest, we're our weakest. Now that threat not to show up will be following us for years, because next time people on the right will be pissed off. They will, in their field, legitimately threaten not to show up. Now, if you're in a position where all tribes of Israel hold the military as hostage, and if the government doesn't, if the government does something that they think is completely immoral, so they hold the army, military as hostage, so that would probably be that every government in Israel is crippled. That means that this government can't do a judicial reform, and the next government can evacuate settlements in the West Bank, right? So this is a dark spot that will be following us for years to come. So those are, I think that's my attempt to try to explain the power of this protest. There's a dark side, the issue that's going to be following us for years, the threat not to show up in the military, and there is the unbelievable, more than shocking achievement of this protest, to be passionate and not violent, to be patriotic and liberal, and to be against the government and passionately for the country. That's my first take on the nature of the protest movement. Rabbi.
Wow, thank you. Just first of all, thank you. Just one question on the third point that you made about the marriage of patriotism and liberalism. Can you just say a word about, to what extent is the Arab story, the Palestinian story, the Matzav, the West Bank, the occupation, pick your noun, to what extent is that implicated in the protest movement at all? And if not, is that also a story?
This is on the periphery of the protest. You hear the occupation Palestinian narrative, but that's not the core of the protest. The core of the protest is to save Israel from a hostile takeover.
Right.
With the political branch of government taking over the judicial branch of government.
How do Arab Israelis and Palestinians, how do they see all this energy on the streets?
I don't know the answer to that question. Like, I know our enemies are interpreting it as a weakness. The Israeli Arabs, I know some of the protesters are trying to bring them on board. Some Arabs are joining, most of them aren't. They still feel, and by the way, I could only assume that a protest filled with flags of Israel, if you're an Arab in Kfar Qasim, maybe you feel less comfortable joining those protests.
Got it. Okay, good. Part two.
Okay. So last time, a few months ago, whenever it was, we discussed the different arguments on both sides of the debate. Boring. There are arguments, constitutional arguments on both sides, blah, blah. What's really happening in Israel is different. I mean, those arguments are right, but they are just a proxy for a tremendous amount of energy that's been unleashed in Israel. I want to listen to the emotional energy from both sides of this divide. And I want to start with Israelis on the right, Israelis that want this reform, that for 30 years have been dreaming for this reform, and to explain how they feel about it. So this is and without understanding, and after that, I'll try to explain the sentiment on it's not the left. I'm just saying economically, I'll call it the left, but the protesters, they're also right-wingers, they're centrists. It's not really a clean left. But I'll start with clear, but the people that are for the reform are almost all on the right. So I could call them right-wingers, some of them extreme right-wingers, some not. If you listen to them, many times you won't be speaking about the constitutional arrangement of Israel. They'll be speaking about events happening in 1944, when Mapai, when Ben-Gurion's party was handing over people from the right to the British, what's called the saison. The saison, I think in French, means a season, but it means a hunting season, where the labor left was hunting down right-wingers and handing over from the Etzel, handing them over to the British. They had reason to do that, but it doesn't matter. In the narrative of the right, that's a trauma. The Altalena, 1948, Ben-Gurion gives an order to shoot down a boat of the Etzel when Begin was on the boat. 16 people died, maybe 19, I'm not sure. Wikipedia afterwards. I think it was 16. Later now, so we have your tribe that feels like it was persecuted by the other tribe for the past 75 years. Oslo was a moment. I won't go into Oslo now, but the biggest open wound is the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning all this is because any attempt to have a dialogue with Israeli right-wingers that are for these protests, they'll bring everything back to the Altalena, but back to Oslo. But the most important bruise is the disengagement. And there's so much to share here, but I just want to say the narrative of the right. So when Israel decided to evacuate all the Jews living in Gaza, taking them out of their homes in northern Samaria against their will, there were serious protests. People on the right were going to the streets to fight, to stop the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. And there's many stories of how the police took people that were protesting, threw them in jail. And there's a famous story of a few, I think, teenage girls who were 14 were thrown into jail. And I want to quote an Israeli journalist called Amit Segal, a very important Israeli journalist. This is how he puts it in a public conversation I had with him time passes, 2 or 3 months ago when this whole thing began. I forgot, whatever. And he said, this is how he said, and when they threw 14-year-olds in jail, we called the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is there to protect human rights from the power of the government. And then he says, we called the Supreme Court. There was no one home. No one answered. There is this feel that the entire establishment is against a certain tribe. Okay? And this frustration built up about 75 years, and it's all unleashed now. What they're trying to say is, when we're not in power, you use your power against us, and when we're in power, you take the power away from us. It goes, like I explained, from the Knesset to the Supreme Court. So here's what we want. We want to be in power. We won the elections, and we want, when we're in power, to have the power. And stop, and they sense this 75 years of humiliation, 75 years of frustration is built up, and it's exploding at this moment, 2023. Now I want to listen to the other tribe. The other tribe has a different narrative, and it goes like this. The other tribe, the tribe people that are protesting in the streets, this beautiful, powerful protest in the streets, if we listen to their narrative, some people speak about the judicial reform, but actually they're speaking about a reality that's much larger than judicial reform. They think that Israel is going to become Iran. They think that after this reform is over, that's not the end, it's only the beginning. And the next day, they'll be legislating laws against the gay community, secular community, non-Jews, women. The very powerful image of all the protests is, I forgot how you say it in English, the Netflix series that, the woman in red.
Yeah.
So that image, what's that called? So anyway, there is this narrative that this government is going to crush rights of women and turn Israel into a state of halacha, like Iran. And we're going to lose all our rights, all our liberties. And this reform didn't create these anxieties. They were already there. Looking at the demography, the future of Israel being very Haredi, looking at birth rate, seeing Israel's going to be very right-wing, very messianic, very extreme. And you put all this together, all these anxieties, and this reform comes, this judicial reform or judicial revolution, and it just unleashed all these anxieties. So Rabbi, here you have it. One side feels frustration, the other side feels anxiety. The frustration of one side goes all the way back to the Altalena, 75 years of frustration. But this frustration built up from all of the past of Israel. The anxiety of the other side is built up anxiety, but it's not anxiety from our past, it's an anxiety directed at our future. So we have here an emotional clash of frustration meets anxiety. Frustration from the past meets anxiety from the dystopian future. That's the clash. Two tribes. One tribe feels that the other tribe, like the right, feels that the left has been persecuting it for years. That's their narrative. So many people want to argue with that narrative. It doesn't matter what the facts are. These are the solid, authentic emotions of an entire Israeli tribe. If you want to understand Israel, you have to listen to these emotions of this tribe. They feel like the elitist left has been humiliating them for years. And the other side, another tribe, feels like the religious right is going to take over, crush their rights, and in the future they will be crushing them, persecuting, humiliating them. You see, I've been in a conversation where one side says, if this reform pass, Israel will be a dystopia. And the other side says, if we are already a dystopia, we need the reforms to stop being a dystopia. So we have like these two very, very small. So this is not an argument versus argument. It's one baggage of emotions versus a different box of emotions. Frustration, anxiety, past, future. That's what's clashing in the streets of Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem as we're talking. That was part two, Rabbi.
Yeah.
That was my 10th. Yes.
Just one quick question on that.
Yes.
In 77, Begin won. After 8 failed attempts, on his 9th, he became prime minister. And isn't that the moment where the Mizrahi community and the more to the right community got political power? So
Exactly.
in that case, right. So I'm just trying to understand, it feels like the right that is so frustrated over 75 years has largely had most of the power since 1977.
Exactly. This is the reason why they're frustrated, because the narrative is, by the way, there's not just their narrative. There's the dean of the law department at Tel Aviv University is actually said this, that ever since that power started shifting from the Knesset to the Supreme Court in the 1980s. So why am I blanking on his name? Well, so ever since I turned 47 and now 48, I forgot all the names. So, okay. So the dean of the law department at the university, right, he says power started shifting in the 80s from the political branch of government to the judicial branch of governments once the right made it there, and that's what created the narrative that the power was in the Knesset when the left was populating the Knesset. But now that the left is not elected the Knesset, the power is not in the Knesset anymore. It's moved to the Supreme Court, where the left is still the majority. So that's the narrative. So here's that's why I said the narrative goes like this: now I'm a right winger. When we weren't in power, you used your power against us, and when we achieved power, political power, you took the power away from us. Okay, that's the narrative. Menachem Mautner is the name of the dean. It was just my psychological needs. I had to say this. Menachem Mautner is the dean of Tel Aviv. It used to be the dean of law department at Tel Aviv University. That's behind this narrative. Right. Okay. So now I want to move to a third question. Is civil war? By the way, is it only in Israel or also you all hearing those two words, civil war in Israel, as a potential outcome? Is that also alive in your discourse in the States?
Well, all the time, because our main way of getting information about Israel is from, Yehuda Kurtzer and Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi, and they've been worrying out loud about civil war since all this began. Okay. So I'll tell you what worries me. There's, after Yom Ha'atzmaut, we might say a change in the dynamic. And it's a following change. The people protesting against the judicial reform won't be the only protesters. The right is trying to conquer the streets also. It had an experiment last week. It was very successful, brought out tens of thousands of protesters. And they wanted to bring in 1 million people after Yom Ha'atzmaut. Okay. Which means we could imagine a reality where we have two groups protesting simultaneously in the streets of Israel. The group for the reform, the group that feels frustrated from our past, and the group against the reform, the group that's terrified from the future. And this is the first time we might see, this is what we'll see, we saw this in a small scale, we'll see this on large scale around Israel, group versus group. And then, Rabbi, I'm asking, will the miracle of a lot of passion, no violence, will that miracle stay alive? Or will we just be like
the Israeli miracle is over, we'll just be like all the nations. There's a lot of passion. There's a lot of violence. Like, will we be able to pull that off? That's our big, big test of after Yom Ha'atzmaut. But what I'm afraid is of two things. One, of violence, and two, the narrative changing. Because imagine right now, all the people protesting, they're protesting against the government. They're not protesting against the voters of this government. They love the voters of this government. They don't like the government. It's a very Bibi-oriented, Ben-Gvir-oriented, dictatorship, abstract-oriented protest. But once the government has its supporters on the streets, and there might be clash, that might change not only the outcome, but also the narrative. The narrative will start feeling like it's not us versus government, it's us versus them. It's not a vertical battle, the civilians from the bottom against the government from the top, but say now it's a horizontal battle. It's this tribe against that tribe. Now that I think is an important step, a dangerous step, the narrative changing. It's not government versus civilians. It's civilians versus civilians. It's tribe versus tribe. It's all this pregnant, like all this potential frustration versus anxiety, unleashing and clashing in the streets of all over Israel, and narrative changing. And that is something that's very, very dangerous. And now I want to discuss, okay, how theoretically, how does civil war happen? This has everything to do with how polarized societies work. I've been thinking a lot about this. I want to share this insight with you. In polarized societies, there's research done about this. Here's one definition for polarization. It's the rise of a very specific brand of hate. If you hate someone because they're black, because of the color of their skin, you're racist. If you hate someone because of their gender, that's misogyny. If you hate someone because they're a leftist or because they're a Bibi supporter or because they're a Trump supporter, that's polarization. Polarization is a very specific brand of hate. It's a very, I think, weird brand of hate, by the way. Hating someone because of their political opinion, because of their politics. Okay? And in a polarized world, that very specific brand of hate grows very, very, very strong. Now, what's a problem in a society where a very specific brand of hate becomes a very powerful brand of hate? What happens in that kind of society? So one of the things that happen is that the tribes that hate each other misunderstand each other. Because in a polarized world, people have a tendency to imagine that the other side has intentions it doesn't have and opinions that it doesn't have. For example, I've seen this research about your country. Republicans were asked, how patriotic are Democrats? And Republicans said they imagine that Democrats are not patriotic at all. And then they asked Democrats, and it turns out most Democrats love America. At the same time, Democrats were asked, are Republicans, do they have liberal values? Do they believe in basic freedoms? And no, they don't. They don't. That's what they told the pollsters. And they asked Republicans, and it turns out Republicans, not all of them, but the average, are very, very liberal. So we have a tendency to paint the other side in colors that we imagine. But this is, I think, what we do. This is what we do. Oh, by the way, the same experiment happened in Israel. My friend Shmuel Rosner is behind following. Israel has a hybrid formula. We are a Jewish democracy. A Jewish democracy. That's a hybrid formula of Israel. And people on the right were asking, do you think that the leftists believe in the hybrid formula of Israel? And they said, no. What leftists want is Israel as a democracy, not a Jewish democracy. And then you ask leftists, do you want us to be a Jewish democracy? Over 90% said, yeah, it's important for us that it's Jewish, not just a democracy. And vice versa. People on the left are asking people on the right, do they believe in the hybrid formula of Israel? And they said, no, they don't. They believe Israel should be a Jewish state, but they don't really want Israel to be a democratic state. They ask people on the right, over 88% said, yeah, it's important for us, it'll be a democratic state also. So we imagine that the other side has opinions that it doesn't have. That's what we do in a polarized world. And I think what we actually do is the following. We see the most extreme version of the other side, and we believe that the extreme version of the other side represents the entire other side. That's what we do. We paint the other side in the colors of the most extreme version of the other side. That's what we do in a polarized world. Okay, now why is that problem? First of all, so hatred creates radical misunderstandings of each other. Radical misunderstandings could create civil war. Here's why. Let me just give an example. Here's the thing, because when I imagine that the other side is much more extreme than it really is, so I start responding to the opinions I think it has and not to the opinions that it actually has. And I respond to the opinions I think it has and become more violent, and they respond to me, and then it spirals. Now let me share with you a very important story. The last time Israel was on the verge of civil war was in the summer of 1948. Just a few months after our foundation in May, a boat filled with immigrants, olim, and weapons made its way from France to Israel. We were in the middle of our War of Independence, and there was a ceasefire, a very short ceasefire at the beginning of the war. Now, this boat, it's a complicated story, and we don't have time to cover all the subtleties and all the nuances here. But it was a boat with guns. That the people who bought the guns and were in charge of this boat were people from the Etzel, the right. And by this time, Israel is established, and the government is by labor, Ben Gurion, the left. So now we have a boat filled with guns. So Begin, that represented the right, negotiated with Ben Gurion, what do we do with all these guns? And they reached a deal. I won't go into it now, it's a little too complicated. Almost all the guns will go to the military, some of the guns will go to Etzel warriors in Jerusalem. Something went wrong. The negotiations collapsed. The boat makes it to Kfar Vitkin, north of Tel Aviv. Begin jumps on the boat in Kfar Vitkin, and the boat goes to Tel Aviv. When Ben Gurion realizes Begin is taking the boat filled with guns to Tel Aviv, he gives an order to shoot the boat. This is the Altalena, which I mentioned in the beginning. And as I said, I think 16 died. Why did he give the order to shoot a boat filled with Jewish immigrants? Just want to make aliyat. Those guns were supposed to go to the army. Those immigrants were supposed to come to Israel. Why did he do that? Why did he do that and risk triggering civil war? Because if Begin had responded using fire, this would spiral into civil war while we are fighting for our independence. So why did Ben Gurion give that order? So I've been speaking to historians the past 2 weeks, and here's an interesting theory I've learned. There was a rumor in Tel Aviv that Begin is planning a putsch. He's planning a takeover of Tel Aviv. He's planning to take all his soldiers and to attack the headquarters of Ben Gurion in a certain hotel in Tel Aviv. This is actually Yitzhak Rabin, in his autobiography he wrote in the 70s. That's what he said. Yigal Alon, the commander of the Palmach, said that Ben Gurion told him he thinks Begin wants to take over Tel Aviv and probably all of Israel. Now, Begin didn't have these intentions at all. But Ben Gurion imagined that those were Begin's intentions. So when he shot at the boat, who did he shoot at? He didn't shoot at the real Menachem Begin. He shot at the image he had of Menachem Begin. He was shooting at his own imagination. He was shooting at his own anxiety. That is how polarization leads to misunderstanding that could lead to civil war. The only way to overcome this, and by the way, the Altalena could have led to civil war, and the only reason why it did not lead to civil war was because Menachem Begin didn't shoot back. We were that close to go into civil war. Because when you hate someone, you misunderstand that someone, and then you respond not to that someone, but to the way you understand or misunderstand that someone. And that's how civil war could break out. Today in Israel, Israelis do not understand each other. Today in Israel, people on the left think that the entire right hold the positions of the most extreme right. And people on the right think that, I'll give you an example of a conversation I had a conversation between a person living in a settlement in the West Bank. And I told him, and he was saying to me, you know, all those protesters and protesters, they want to come down and knock down my house and throw me out of my house. I told him, dude, they don't want to do that. That's not what these protests are about. Like, that's the question you asked me, Rabbi. How much is the occupation of the Palestinian Israel part of this protest? It's not a big deal. But I did say some protesters are speaking about that. That's the voice he heard. All those protesters in Tel Aviv want to take me out of my house. I said, dude, that's not what it's about. That's not what they want to do. And actually, according to polls, most of them don't want to do that, especially not tomorrow, not in the near future. There's no Palestinian partner of the whole shebang. But then I told them, do you know what they think about you? You think they want to take you out of your house. They think you want to enter their house and regulate their behavior and ask and make sure they're reading the right books and praying to the right God. That's what they think. They think you want to enter their house. You think they want to take you out of your house. The truth is, I know you. You don't want to enter their house. Maybe people on the extreme right want to, but what they're doing, they're imagining the entire right the way they understand the extreme right. And you're imagining all the protesters, you're painting them with the colors of only the most extreme left-wing protesters. That's the misunderstanding we're having in Israel. Myself, I participated in an interesting dialogue between rabbis, hardcore rabbis, and high-tech leaders. And afterwards, I asked the rabbis, what do you think of the high-tech leaders? And they said, I was so surprised that these high-tech leaders love Israel and they're Zionists. They didn't think they were Zionists. They thought they were liberal individuals living, they don't care about our country. I asked the high-tech people, what do you think about the rabbis? They said, we were surprised that they're democratic, that they actually want an independent Supreme Court. They have a different opinion on how to do that. We're surprised that they want Israel to be a democracy. Until we meet, we don't understand each other. We don't understand each other, and we respond to the way we imagine the other and not to the way the other actually is. And that's how misunderstandings become explosive. By the way, the best way to increase misunderstanding is to understand each other through social media. The best way to overcome misunderstanding is to meet and talk face to face, like what happened when rabbis met high-tech leaders in front of my eyes. That was my third point, Rabbi.
Yeah, so Micah, you said you've been writing about this and talking about this in Hebrew. What impact is your writing and you're talking about it and sharing stories like the rabbis and the high-tech? What effect is that having on the dynamic in Israel today? When you say what you've just said to us, to fellow Israelis in Hebrew, is that being heard?
Very, very much so. Let me share with you something. I'm going to be showing off a little bit, Wes, but I don't think I'm doing this just because, probably also because of my ego, but not only. I think this has the power to clarify something. Israel, I think, is facing not one but two threats. One threat is what I call sakanat ha'ishtaltut, a hostile takeover of the political branch over the judicial branch. That's what you all call Israel turning from democracy to dictatorship. That's sakanat ha'ishtaltut, a hostile takeover over the judicial system. That's one threat. The second threat is sakanat ha'itbalkut, the danger of Israel collapsing into itself, collapsing into chaos, collapsing into civil war. Different tribes first hating each other, then which leads to not understanding each other, and in the end to attacking each other. Now, so these are two different threats, very different threats. And I think the difference between Israelis we're all afraid of two. The difference between which threat do you give more weight to? Israel turning to a dictatorship or Israel collapsing into civil war? What's more scary? Where do you think is the real problem? I think most of my personal energy is directed on the second problem of civil war, of collapsing, of misunderstanding, of hatred. That's where I'm taking. There's also an Israeli political leader called Benny Gantz. That he's, I think, the only Israeli political leader right now that is really addressing the two problems, not just one. Not only the problem of Israel turning to a dictatorship, but especially the danger of Israel collapsing. And what we see is on the political level, you see that the Israeli leaders becoming most powerful in Israel today is Benny Gantz. All the politicians are playing the politics of dividing us or weakening in the polls. Benny Gantz, that's playing the politics of uniting us, is the strongest politician today, according to the Israeli polls. This is, by the way, a few months ago, unthinkable. That's one. And two is where I show off. I have a podcast in Israel. It's called Mifleget HaMachshavot. And I'm sharing these type of insights, trying to help Israelis understand each other. So you can imagine there are many podcasts of Israelis that are polarizing, they're divided, they're telling stories about the horrible left and what they want to do to us, and the horrible right, what they want to do to us. And what I'm trying to do is share all narratives all the time and help people understand each other. And my podcast, our podcast has been last week the #1 podcast in Israel. So this is showing off, but it's also saying something that Israelis are thirsty for more complicated narratives that could glue us together. And I think that explains the political rise of guns. That explains the rise of narratives like my own, like we see in Spotify becoming the most popular, it's one of the 2 most popular podcasts in Israel.
Well, thank you. So part 4, how do we avoid civil war?
Okay, so here's our problem. Okay, one tribe feels like for 75 years it's been humiliated by the other tribe. And now it's comeback time. Another tribe feels like the next 75 years, we will be controlled by this messianic, right-wing, anti-civil rights, Haredi tribe. Please save us, okay? So that's one dynamic. But there's another dynamic, Rabbi. And the other dynamic is the following. You look at the polls and you see something else completely. You see that according to the polls, most Israelis agree on what we can do now. Again, it's the paradox of Israel. On social media, we hate each other. On the streets, we despise each other. And according to the polls, we agree with each other. We agree with each other. It's a weird agreement. I won't analyze the polls to you now. I just want to say something. Here's what more than 70% of Israelis would agree on. There needs to be a judicial reform, but that's a judicial reform that we all agree on, that there's a massive majority. So this is the Israeli consensus. There is a majority of Israelis that want the reform, though that majority of Israelis will agree with. It's a cyclical consensus. There's a majority of people that believe that a reform is only legitimate if it enjoys a very solid majority. Okay. So what does that mean? It means on the left, you have people that saying no reform, no change, status quo. On the right, you have people saying a reform, radical reform, and now we don't need a larger majority. What we have is enough. And most Israelis want a reform, not this reform, a reform that's achieved through a broad, because many Israelis feel like the judicial system needs to be reformed. Just can't be, in a way, it can't be quick, it can't be not balanced, and it has to enjoy a broad consensus. So how is it possible that we hate each other in social media, we're divided into 2 tribes in the streets, and then we agree in the polls? How is that possible? So I would say, now I want to be naive for a minute and say, well, polls show what we think rationally. On the streets, we see what we feel emotionally. So now I want to be naive. If we'll only be less emotional and more rational, it won't be frustration versus anxiety. It will be the hidden consensus we see in the polls. So let's just all be less emotional, more rational, we'll solve the problem. The problem with what I just said is that it's ridiculous. We can't not be emotional. We can't be rational. Rabbi, you know I love Maimonides, but I think I'm a little bit over him, because that's not what human nature is. We are emotional, we're tribal, that's what we are. And we can't ask people, just be Maimonidean and Aristotelian and rational and realize that we agree while we have all these tribal emotions clashing inside of us. So I don't think being rational is the solution. So I was reading this book by Adam Grant, and he describes how when there is an emotional clash, so the best way to deal with a clash is not to be less emotional, but to be more emotional, which means in our neshama, in our soul, it's messy in there, right? We look inside in our souls. It's messy in there. And what we don't find is only one emotion. There's a variety of emotions that contradict each other, right? So within us, we have tribal emotions. We also have national emotions. So by broadening the range of our emotions, we could get out of this. And my best example for a leader that through broadening the range of his emotions, we avoided civil war is Menachem Begin. I described the Altalena from Ben Gurion's point of view. imagining Begin wants to take over Tel Aviv, and then shooting at his own imagination. But now let's see the same episode from Menachem Begin's point of view. Menachem Begin, his boat is shot down. He jumps into the water, probably not only frustrated, but filled with rage. And you can only imagine what his advisors are telling him. It's a time to plan the revenge. We're going to shoot back. We're going to sabotage the labor, Mapai. We're going to get back. They killed 16 of our people. We'll kill 70 of their people. We'll show them. You can imagine all those voices of Mount Begin. And by the way, I think it'd be sympathetic towards those. At a moment where one tribe bombs the other tribe, you can imagine the amount of tribal rage they had at that moment. You know what Begin did? At that moment, he went on the radio. He gave this very, very famous, passionate speech. The speech was filled with rage, filled with hate towards Mapai. Mapai is like the left, okay? Like Mifleget Poalei Eretz Yisrael is Mapai, the labor movement of Israel. And then he says, never shoot back. We will not shoot back. I want to interpret Begin's decision not to retaliate. When he chose not to retaliate, it means that he didn't have only tribal emotions, he also had a national emotion. And at that moment, he enabled the national emotion to overcome the tribal emotion. He was saying that this is actually what he was saying. And I'm going to paraphrase on something that one of the people in the audience said to me 2 months ago. What Begin was saying is the following: I love Israel more than I hate Mapai. That's what when he didn't shoot back, that was his declaration. I love Israel more than I hate Mapai. Now just think about that framing and think about how much he hated Mapai. How much he hated Mapai that just shot down the boat with all the ammunition and all the guns and 16 people die. And then he said, I love Israel more than I hate Mapai, because he realized that if he attacks back, Mapai will attack back. It will spiral into civil war. While we're in the War of Independence, we probably wouldn't have had a state. But he, instead of overcoming his tribal emotions, he broadened his emotions. He has a national emotion, and the national emotion guided him, not his tribal emotion. Now, that moment, 2,000 years beforehand, when the Romans were attacking Jerusalem, there was civil war inside Jerusalem. And Josephus Flavius describes how there were three tribes there: the tribe of Shimon bar Giora, and the tribe of Elazar ben Shimon, and the tribe of Yochanan Migush Chalav. And they were attacking each other and destroying each other and fighting each other. And then the Romans came, and they were already crippled. They were starving, and it was very easy to take over Jerusalem. Because back then, in Beit Sheni, in their second temple, the tribal emotions were stronger than the national emotions. It was more important them to fight each other than to fight. It was more important for them to fight the other tribe than to fight the Romans with the other tribe. That's what they missed. Tribalism destroyed Jerusalem in the second temple. When Begin didn't shoot back, this is what he said. He said, the pathology of our second temple will not replicate itself in the first moments of the third one. That's what his declaration on the Altalena. And Rabbi, that spirit of Begin, that's what's going to take us out of the catch we're in. That one tribe feels like it was humiliated for 75 years for their tribe. Okay, you're right. I'm not asking you not to hate the left. I'm asking you to love Israel more than you hate the left. One tribe says, I'm terrified that this Haredi Israel is taking over and I'm afraid of them. When you're afraid of someone, you hate someone. I'm not asking you not to hate them. I'm asking you to love Israel more than you hate them. That's the Begin model. That's the Menachem Begin model. Not overcoming your emotions, but enriching your emotions, broadening your emotions, holding on to because national says to you, when I'm tribal, it's me against the other tribe. When I'm national, it's me with the other tribe. Which one of these emotions is going to be the dominant emotion? Now this is important, because for us to reach compromise, a good compromise, then on the other side, people on the right feel like, yes, their government has more power. And people on the left will feel it's not only the left, I know, that their rights are protected more than ever by the Supreme Court. For us, and those, by the way, there are compromises. I've seen them that could achieve exactly that. But in order to achieve a compromise, we need both tribes to trust each other. For them to trust each other, we need their emotions. We can't ask them to calm their emotions. We can only ask them to expand their range of emotions. We're entering Pesach, a moment where we remember we're not a tribe, we're a nation. We're entering Yom HaZikaron, where we're not a tribe, we're a nation. We're entering Yom HaTzmaut, we're not a tribe or a nation. I'm sounding naive, and I listen to myself, and I know I sound naive. But the opportunity we have in these moments is not to overcome our hatred, our frustration, and our anxiety for the other tribe, but just to have next to that tribal emotion, another emotion, a national emotion. If the national emotion will override the tribal emotion, we can repeat Begin's heroism and not Ben Gurion's misunderstanding on the Altalena. Maybe we have a good chance on the other side to survive, to escape civil war and to reach the other side with a constitutional moment that will make us stronger than we were when we entered this tremendous episode that we're in.
Wow. Micah, first of all, we don't even have words to thank you for your wisdom and your brilliance. So we'll spend all Pesach trying to process it. Two quick questions before we wrap up. One is, what's happening on the ground now in Israel since the ceasefire, so to speak? Are the two sides talking? Are they doing what you're talking about? Are they expanding their emotions? Is Bibi a student of history? Does Bibi get Begin? Does Bibi realize this is my opportunity to pull a Menachem Begin? I can be Begin. Is that happening on the ground? That's the first question.
I hope Lapid will want to pull a Menachem Begin. That Bibi will pull a Menachem Begin. I know Gantz is trying to pull a Menachem Begin. That's the big challenge, to pull a Menachem Begin and not a Ben Gurion. I love Ben Gurion. I admire Ben Gurion. I'm talking about a very specific Ben Gurion. The Ben Gurion that shoots at the boat is a Ben Gurion that projects a certain image on the other side and then shoots at the image. And we need to not to pull a Ben Gurion on the boat and to pull a Begin on the boat. That's, I think, our big challenge now. That's how you avoid civil war. I can't tell you about Bibi. I can't tell you. I mean, we're all honest. Is Israel still very, very hostile? Is there a lot of tribal emotions? 100%. 100%. We see that all over the place. But do we get a sense that there's also national emotions? That we have not only we have strong narratives that tribe is bad and our tribe is good, like very clear binary narratives. We have that. We also have a narrative that we belong to a nation that includes the other tribe. The tribe I hate, it's a part of my nation. I'll fight for it and I'll die for it. We have that also. We have both. So right now, I think the tribal, if I could sense, I don't know if I have the radars that could sense the emotions of the nation. But if I can, I think right now we're much more tribal. Our challenges towards this period of Pesach, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut, is to connect to the narrative that unites us without canceling the narratives that divide us, but make it more messy in there. Let's have two narratives in there.
Micah, but I guess my question is, are Israeli political leaders on both sides speaking publicly the way you just have? I mean, it would be so powerful if Prime Minister Netanyahu did that. It would be so powerful if the head of the opposition did that.
All I could say is that Bibi, the night where he said he's going to freeze the legislation, he had an opportunity to be a Begin. He was more of a Ben Gurion. Yes, it was more us again. I mean, I'm talking about Ben Gurion on the boat. It's a very, very limited area. Okay, there is a lot of Ben Gurion.
Right.
It was more us against them. It was more. Yeah, it was. He didn't rise. He might still rise to the moment. I don't know. Right now, Menachem Begin. What I'm trying to do, like Hawks in Israel, is to revive the myth of Begin that didn't shoot back.
Right.
That didn't shoot back. That his love for Israel was stronger than his hatred for the tribe that shot at him. Right. That's the image. But will Bibi be a Begin? That would be amazing. I don't know. I don't know if he will. Well, I don't know.
Wow. Micah, last question for you. You're talking to a largely American Jewish audience. It's largely members of Temple Emmanuel and largely other members of Greater Jewish Boston. Plus, as I understand it, some Israelis who are in Boston for the year studying at Harvard. One of the questions that I know members of Temple Manual are asking every day, which we've never really been able to answer very well, is what can we do to be helpful to you? What can we do here in the safety of Newton and Greater Boston to be helpful to Israel, this land that we love, our homeland that we love? Tell us what to do and we'll do it, Micha.
Okay, here's the problem. In Israel, we're not having the problem is we're having a passionate argument. The problem is that we're not having an argument. We're having a real debate in Israel. Right now, President Herzog is starting something. Representatives of all sides entering the residence of the president in Jerusalem, trying to start a dialogue, but it's very hard because in the background, social media will be making it very hard for them to compromise. Anyone that compromises will do great for Israel, will probably destroy his own political value because his base will see him as a sellout. Okay, so how do we overcome that? If Israel has not one, but two strategic threats, actually has three, we also have security threats. This is, okay. By the way, it's possible that we'll avoid civil war in the end, not because we all became Menachem Begins, but because something external happened and it changed the whole dynamic. Okay, you know what I'm talking about. There might be something external that will change the whole dynamic. So it's very, I can't make any predictions. Like, it's very hard to know how this is going to happen. But here's what I would ask from you is, when you're thinking about Israel and you love Israel, you're caring for Israel, and you're asking how to be involved, I would focus your energy on the problem of Israel collapsing into civil war. Not the problem of Israel not being a democracy, but Israel collapsing. I'll tell you why. The problem of Israel not being a democracy, there's so many voices out there, including President Biden. One more voice, that's not going to make a difference. But people on the right, when they feel like everyone is getting up against them, they feel weak, a minority, misunderstood. There's a narrative on the right, we're second-class citizens. It's a new narrative on the right. We're second-class citizens because we're in power. We want these reforms. You knocked down these reforms because the whole world ganged up against us. We don't have any power. We're second. This is a very not healthy narrative. What we need is to take Israel to a place where no one wins. No one wins, Israel wins. The right doesn't win, the left doesn't win. We all lose because Israel won, because there'll be a compromise that no one will like. But in order for us to accept a compromise, we have to start promoting compromise. So my ask from you is, there's an argument in Israel now. Actually, ask Israelis to have an argument and ask Israelis to compromise. Don't choose sides. Don't choose sides. But just promote the atmosphere that will enable an argument, and that will give us, Israelis from both sides, the courage to compromise, to find a better constitutional arrangement for Israel, where no one can have a victory speech, because a victory speech of the right means we defeated the left. A victory speech of the left means we defeated the right. But if one side feels defeated, Israel was defeated. This is President Herzog's insight in his speech a week and a half ago. If no one wins, Israel wins. If one side loses, Israel lost.
So Micha, thank you. Just one last follow-up question on that. So, the brilliance of your talk is that you talk about the emotional fires fueling this, the emotional story, the emotional narrative. And I guess my question is, compromise, if you are operating from a place of deep emotion, they've been screwing us for 75 years, or they're gonna screw us in the next 75 years, right? That passion, right? Then compromise feels like milquetoast, like a weak word. Like, I'm talking about righteous anger or deep-rooted fear, and now you're giving me compromise. So how do you make compromise sexy enough that it can sell?
Compromise is good for Israel. Victory is good for my tribe. If we're Menachem Begins, from the perspective of Israel, compromise is good. The perspective of my tribe, I want to screw them, right? That's the Menachem Begin move. only if we see this conflict from the point of view of Jewish history, of Am Yisrael, is compromise victory. Or if we see it from a tribal point of view, compromise is dirty, it's a sellout, only a traitor would compromise with the fascist right, the whole narrative, right?
Right.
So that's why we need to be, that's the Menachem Begin move. That's experiencing this from a national point of view. Compromise is victory. Victory. That's what it is that's what Am Yisrael needs. But if I think just as a tribe, I'm not playing for Am Yisrael, I'm playing to defeat the other team. So I'll play, so there's no tribes. So there's no compromise. And those voices are heard in Israel. People that are against compromise on both sides are heard. American Jews should call for compromise. Don't choose a tribe, choose Am Yisrael. That's what I'm telling you. Choose Am Yisrael.
Micha, deep gratitude. Chag Sameach, Chag Kasher Sameach. We love you. We appreciate you. We're so grateful to you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
We're something like 300 Jews from Greater Boston are coming to Israel. 400. No. 400 are on the call. 300 are actually getting on airplanes and going to Israel. Some 62 people from Temple Emmanuel are getting on airplanes and coming to Israel in a few weeks for Yom HaAtzmaut. And of course, we have more coming over the summer for Hartman. We have 350 people from Greater Boston getting on planes and coming, and 62 from Temple Emmanuel. More coming in June, and we will do our part to be your partners. And we are so grateful to you, Micha. Lots of love from Newton to Jerusalem. Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy and Brian, and thank you all for being on this call. Lots of love.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.